So do you want to do that response video now?
Yeah, surprisingly, within a couple hours of the debate, someone posted a response on my moral argument, which I thought was like, well, okay, that's kind of quick. I don't. So yeah, someone posted like a 20-minute response video to my video. Is God the same as the moral goodness? And so I mean, there was a couple issues I saw on it that I was like, not really. But he basically tried to argue that you can't say that God is identical to the good. That's one of his issues with divine command theory, and I don't really like that term, but I guess that might be where I fall. I don't know exactly. But did you get a chance to take a look at it?
Briefly, I started watching it, and it's one of those people who don't really.
Well, I think one of the issues is he got too caught up in analogies. Like, he says, like, the existence of God cannot explain or ground the existence of the good. The claim that God serves as the foundation of the good is no more sensible than the claim that H2O serves as the foundation of water.
Eric Wielenberg is saying that the fact that good exists cannot be explained by the fact that God exists, since they are metaphysically identical. Similarly, you can't explain the fact that water exists by saying that H2O exists. If someone were to ask why does water exist, it would not be an explanation to say since H2O exists.
And he kind of goes off on this whole thing. He's saying, like, you either have to say the good is grounded in God, or you have to say that God is identical to the good. And you can't, because if you're going to make an identification theory, then you're going to use it like its water is like H2O. You're trying to identify the two. And my basic point is that is an analogy. Analogies are not perfect by definition.
I will explain later why divine command theorists think God equals good is analogous to water equals H2O.
The good is grounded in God, but they're not. There's an epistemic distinction, but there's not an ontological distinction. And we're talking about the moral argument. We're making a metaphysical argument. So just trying to point out in his whole response video is basically that's his main point, is that epistemically the good is different than God. I was like, yeah, I know that's an epistemic distinction, but what I'm talking about is an ontological distinction. And I use the analogy of like your personality, your values, your will. They're grounded in you as a person, but they're not ontologically distinct from you. They're still dependent on you. So, they're dependent on you and they are also you. So you can have it both. You just have to recognize what you're doing. Ontologically, they're identical, but epistemic, you can see some sort of identification distinction there. That's not too much of an issue. We're talking about a response video I got after the debate on my moral argument. I mean, one thing he says, my analogy on that is what does he say? He says, IP says my values are grounded in me in the same way the good is grounded in God, but this is false. The disanalogy is that in the former case, the grounder is distinct from the grounded, while the latter case, the grounder is identical to the grounded. The two types of grounding are not the same. Yeah. But epistemically and ontologically, I get what you got to make that distinction. I get it. There's an epistemic distinction between you and your personality. No one doubts that. But ontologically, your personality is pretty much you. I mean, we're not going to say that we could somehow go in your brain and or go into your consciousness and remove your personality, remove your thoughts out. I mean, we epistemically make these distinctions, but not in an ontological sense.
Personalities are something you have, rather than being what you are. J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig point out a common Christian view: a person is a unity through time. Over the years your body parts come and go, and your various mental states, memories, personality traits etc., come and go. But they are all aspects of the same person. I am essentially my soul, same person, different soul, different person. Moreland and Craig are saying that if you want to account for a unified personal identity through time, you cannot posit something changing like your personality. You are a soul. IP's argument will rest upon a highly controversial view on personal identity, especially among Christians.
And then he also made a problem with, ironically, another confusion with meta-ethics and metaphysics. Like, he tried to show that I contradicted myself when I gave my defense of moral realism, because I argued that there are epistemic oughts that we tend to think are objective. But when I went to my moral argument, I argued that these epistemic oughts are pragmatic. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, yeah, pragmatic.
Yeah.
Pragmatic. Oh, good.
Yeah. Here's the problem where he made in that video is that he confused what we mean by pragmatic. Well, I said in the video that my defense of moral realism, that epistemic oughts are objective, but they're not grounded the same way moral oughts would be. There is the distinction. Again, when I'm talking about the moral argument, I'm in metaphysics. When I did my defense of moral realism, I'm in metaethics. So it's a different thing. They can both be objective when we're talking in metaethics. But when I get to metaphysics, I'm not going to ground them the same way.
IP says I confused metaphysics with metaethics. Does IP not realize that moral metaphysics is an essential part of Cuneo's argument? Cuneo writes, it appears as if epistemic facts are bound to the natural world by the same type of mysterious metaphysical glue that putatively binds moral facts to merely descriptive ones. Far from being utterly different from anything else in the universe, as J. L. Mackie thought, moral and epistemic facts are exactly alike in this putatively objectionable respect. Here, Cuneo is trying to show that Mackie is committed to a queer metaphysical glue, by way of epistemic facts.
So, for example, if I wrote on a board 2 + 2, and I asked you to fill in the blank to solve the equation, you ought to write 4. That's an epistemic ought. That's a normative ought. That would be objectively the right thing to do. Now, that's objective, but it's an epistemic ought. It's not a moral ought. If you write 5 and then scream logic is subjective and run out of the room screaming, I'm not going to think justice has to be done or you violated some moral law. I'm going to like, well, he's just objectively wrong. So you can't have objective oughts that are not moral oughts and still have the moral argument. What I said to this when I was talking to an atheistic non-natural moral realist is I said normative oughts like this, like epistemic oughts, are simply grounded in the pragmatic nature of reality. If you want to be pragmatic, you ought to do this. If you want to be intelligent, you ought to do this. If you want to solve the equation, you ought to do this. But that's descriptive. I mean, you're deriving oughts from descriptions. If you want to be pragmatic, if you want to be in conjunction with how reality operates, you ought to act this way. Those can be grounded in how one pragmatically reacts to reality. That's not necessarily a moral ought, which is, of course, a different classification.
I criticized IP for running Terence Cuneo's argument to support moral realism, and then denying it, to support divine command theory. He can't have it both ways. Let's first watch how IP runs his argument.
The first argument is the argument from epistemic realism, put forward by Terence Cuneo. The argument is as follows. Premise 1. If moral facts do not exist, then epistemic facts do not exist. Premise 2. Epistemic facts do exist. Conclusion 1. Moral facts do exist. Premise 3. If moral facts do exist, then moral realism is true. And the final conclusion is, moral realism is true. The problem that Cuneo identifies is how can a moral skeptic prescribe epistemic oughts while rejecting moral oughts? They are almost identical in how they operate.
IP uses the term pragmatic to represent an if they're not. I will use the term hypothetical to represent an if they're not, to better conform with the literature. A hypothetical ought has the form if you desire X, then you ought to Y. A categorical ought has the form you ought to Y, which holds regardless of your desire. To understand where IP goes wrong, we first need to understand Cuneo's argument. Cuneo writes, there is a class of features, what I call the objectionable features, such that were moral and epistemic facts to exist, they would both display them. According to the standard objections, the objectionable features are what render moral facts queer. If moral facts do not exist, then this is wholly because they would display these features. But presumably there is nothing unique to moral facts that makes their having these features objectionable. It is the features themselves that render moral facts philosophically unacceptable. If this is right, then we can agree that if moral facts do not exist, then nothing has the objectionable features. However, on the assumption that the argument to this point is on target, we also know that if epistemic facts exist, then there is something that has the objectionable features. Put differently, we know that if nothing has the objectionable features, then epistemic facts do not exist. And from these two claims it follows that the core argument's first premise is true: if moral facts do not exist, then epistemic facts do not exist. Cuneo argues that the queer feature of moral oughts is its categoricity, and this queer feature is the same whether you're talking about morality or epistemology. So if you reject categorical moral oughts for being queer, you should also reject categorical epistemic oughts for being queer. But Cuneo argues that hypothetical epistemic oughts are implausible, and we should accept categorical epistemic oughts. Once the naturalist accepts categorical epistemic oughts, they can't object to categorical moral oughts for being queer. Naturalistically minded philosophers often think hypothetical moral oughts are not queer like categorical moral oughts, so they accept the former while rejecting the latter. One kind of queerness is epistemic. For example, consider the hypothetical ought: if you desire to go to the market, you ought to go left. It is scientifically straightforward how we can know that. By contrast, it is mysterious how we can know about categorical oughts like you ought not torture for fun. The perplexing thing is that IP is running Cuneo's argument using hypothetical epistemic oughts. This butchered version of Cuneo's argument is toothless against the person that thinks categorical oughts are queer while hypothetical oughts are not queer. Why should they accept IP's first premise? If categorical moral facts do not exist, then hypothetical epistemic facts do not exist. Cuneo's argument is more like, if categorical moral facts do not exist, then categorical epistemic facts do not exist.
Is there anything else you want to go look in that response video, JD?
Not unless there's anything you want. Like, I can just go up to his red slides because those seem to be.
Well, I don't really know what else to address in that. Those were the two biggest things he was trying to bring up. He tried to say there was a contradiction, but I mean, again, you can ground ontological, the normative oughts different than you would ground moral oughts. It's really hard to ground moral oughts in nature itself.
I will offer a better way to ground morality. William Lane Craig says goodness is grounded in God. He goes on to say that God's goodness consists in virtues, such as being loving, kind, fair, impartial, generous, and so forth. IP has said that he's a virtue ethicist. Why not ground morality directly in the virtues and dispense with the middleman? The type of grounding I'm thinking of here is truth-making, and not an informative identification. That a person is good is made true by good-making virtues. We can see something similar happen with God's greatness. Many Christians are Anselmians and think that God is the greatest conceivable being. God is great because he has great-making properties like omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection. It is true that God is great because these properties are what make him great. God's greatness is grounded in a truth-making way by great-making properties. So why not ground goodness in the good-making virtues, and dispense with God?
Like you could ground basic normative oughts of like, you ought to solve this equation by writing 4. That's just us saying this is how we be pragmatic in an objective way. So I mean, and then the other thing was just, the confusing of the identity, confusing the epistemology with ontology. I wasn't sure if there was anything else.
Anything
address, other than minor things.
Yeah, anything on this page?
What page is that? Let's see. Offer some clear examples. I mean, he did. I believe he just did before this. He was offering. He was saying most moral philosophers think grounding is a primitive idea, and I was like, well, yeah, but a lot of them are also reductionists. So they don't believe in grounding because most of them favor a reductionist type view. When I use reductionism as an analogy for things.
Except grounding reductionism in what reductionism?
Let's get clear on what an informative identification is. It is also known as a synthetic identity or a synthetic reduction. How is reduction used in metaethics? Alexander Miller gives an example of a reductionist view in his book Contemporary Metaethics. Miller writes, Relton holds the reductionist view that moral properties are reducible to complex natural properties, via a synthetic property identity. In other words, a synthetic identity is a reduction. Michael Humer gives some examples of synthetic reductions. He explains, in each of these cases, we have two different concepts that refer to the same phenomenon. The concept water is different from the concept H2O, but there is one thing in reality that both these concepts pick out. Just as water and H2O are metaphysically identical, while being different concepts, divine command theorists say that God and good are metaphysically identical, while being different concepts. This is the point of the analogy. We can understand what a synthetic identity is better by contrasting it with an analytic identity. In an analytic identity, like bachelor equals unmarried male, the concepts flanking the equals sign are identical.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, he's just giving examples of grounding here. I'm not really sure what he was, but the point of this.
The point of this is to show the distinction between clear examples of Shafer types of grounding, and an informative identification type of grounding. Notice that in Shafer's 5 examples, the grounder is not metaphysically identical to the grounded. For example, the person Socrates is not metaphysically identical to the set consisting of Socrates. IP's example of the laws of physics being grounded in the universe seem to be an example of 5. The physical universe is the truth maker for the truth of the laws of physics. And notice that the truth of the laws of physics is not metaphysically identical to the physical universe. It would be strange to say that the laws of physics just is the physical universe. In the following clip, IP wants to use the idea that the laws of physics need grounding to support the idea that the moral law needs grounding.
The first thing we need to note about objective moral values and duties is they must be grounded in something. It doesn't seem rational to say they simply exist ad hoc. For example, the laws of physics are grounded in the existence of the universe.
Once we disentangle his use of grounding, we can see that IP is essentially saying that since the laws of physics need truth makers, the moral laws need informative identifications. The better argument would be that since the laws of physics need truth makers, the moral laws need truth makers.
Unless there's anything you want me to address on here, we can move on.
Well, I mean, it's response to you, so
Yeah,
anything on this.
This is what I was talking about earlier. This is the part I quoted. I mean, sort of, I mean, here's his thing. You see at the bottom, information identifications. Water is H2O. Yeah, but I mean, technically water is reducible to hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah.
I mean, again, when you use water as an analogy, you're not obviously saying it's exactly the same as when we're saying something is grounded in a source. That's it. It's an analogy. Come on, let's have a little bit of principle of charity here. We're using them as analogies. So I mean, I think that's one of the issues with the response is he got way too caught up in the analogy I was using. So, like here he goes on again. Craig thinks of information identical like water is H2O. So this IP thinks that the good is grounded in God, while at the same time the good is identical to God. He is also thinking of grounding in terms of information identification.
Why does IP keep saying information identification instead of informative identification? Is that why he thinks I'm confusing epistemology with ontology? Water is H2O is informative in a way that water is not. The former is a discovery about the world.
Yet IP uses a different view for grounding physics and logic. Well, no. This is the ontological versus epistemic distinction. Obviously, the good is grounded in God, and you can form epistemic distinctions between them. If we couldn't be talking about them right now. Just like I can talk about like your personality is epistemically distinct from your will, your values, your thoughts. But ontologically, it's all just different epistemic aspects of you. It's just you. And good is ontologically identical to God, although it would still be grounded in him, in that sort of way. It's just a part of who God is. He's the necessary rational source of what good is. And so good is grounded in him, and yet good is still intrinsically a part of him.
Now this is truly perplexing. IP said that good is ontologically identical to God, and then he said twice that good is a part of God. Which is it? Divine command theorists in the tradition of Robert Adams say God is identical to the good.
I don't know if there's really anything else addressed in this video. I mean, other than just minor issues here and there that I don't want to get nitpicky on.
Anything here?
What's this? One could question why an information identification is required. We don't have we don't informationally identify roundness with anything concrete in the world. Yeah, but of course we have mathematics. So of course, we can look at mathematics and we can derive certain mathematical equations for roundness in there. I mean, we can calculate a perfectly round circle within a computer now. So, I mean, you could say, yeah, there is no roundness found anywhere in the world. I mean, I guess if he's talking about nature there, I would need him to clarify. But when I say logic is grounded in reality, I say logic is grounded in nature of everything. So a good analogy would be simply that within nature, you can't find a combustion engine, but the potential for a combustion engine is clearly in nature. We can clearly make a combustion engine. So clearly you can find roundness within the potentiality of nature, or within the potentiality of reality itself. It's not too hard to picture a perfect circle based on what we see in nature. These are, again, grounded within all of reality, not just within the physical universe itself.
Again, IP is using two different notions of grounding here. In IP's informative identification type of grounding, God is metaphysically identical to the good. But he is using a different account of grounding for roundness, one that is not an informative identification, since it seems he thinks that no concrete object is metaphysically identical to roundness. If roundness does not need to be informatively identified, then why does goodness? I have already explained how his argument for why the moral law needs to be grounded rests upon an equivocation of grounding.
But yeah, I mean, it just seems like when it always comes to ethics, we always see these, with skeptics, we see these epistemology and ontologically, these epistemic and ontological issues. I mean, there always seems to be confusing the two.
Yeah, is there anything on this slide?
But that's just, he's quoting Moreland and Craig there, so, I don't disagree with that. So, there he is, he's quoting Eric again. So, if goodness is abstract, then people can have the property of goodness by exemplifying goodness in the same way roundness is abstract. And basketballs have the property of roundness by exemplifying roundness. And the divine command theorists, God could say God is equal to good, and people can have properties of goodness by resembling God. One disadvantage that divine command theorists have is that they have a disunified account of goodness and roundness. Divine command theorists cannot say roundness is grounded in God. They need an additional, obviously, I don't believe roundness is grounded in God's commands or God's obligations or God's prescriptions or God's nature. I mean, roundness is just, again, as I've said, it's just a fact of logic. It's not something that we ground in a prescriber. So I'm not really sure where he's going with that.
Here is what I'm getting at. The Platonist and nominalist have a unified account of properties. For the Platonist, all properties are abstract objects. For the trope nominalist, all properties are sets of resembling tropes. The Platonist and trope nominalist give the same account for roundness and goodness. By contrast, the divine command theorist gives one account for goodness, but another account for roundness. William Hasker makes related remarks when he considers how odd it is for modified theistic activists to metaphysically account for the numbers 1, 2 and 3 with the Trinity, while having an alternative metaphysics for the rest of the numbers. Having a unified account of properties is a theoretical virtue.
Yeah, this is one thing about the moral guilt. Yeah, my issue with this is I debated putting it in the video, and that's why I put the caveat in there that it alone by itself is not necessarily a good argument. But you could see if more realism is true, you can actually make that argument. But you would need to do it via examples. Here it is. Here's his response. He says the objection is confused. You wouldn't feel guilt towards an abstract moral principle. That would only be the case if the abstract principle stated you ought to feel guilt towards an abstract moral principle. Instead, the principle could be you ought to love your neighbor as yourself, and you would feel guilt towards persons. Divine command theorists also need to feel. Again, guilt's a feeling. I mean, Peter S. Williams' point is you have guilt because you didn't keep the moral principles that were given to you. And if you feel guilty for them and you didn't actually harm a person, like, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. But I mean, if you've done something morally wrong and yet you feel guilt and yet no one was harmed, perhaps, then it doesn't make sense. You just feel guilty to an abstract principle. You'd feel guilty towards a prescriber who gave you these moral principles. So I think he's kind of confusing the feeling of guilt with the actual moral prescriptions we're given.
Guilt is not a propositional attitude, that is, it is not an attitude we have towards propositions. Trent and Merckx has argued that believing, suspecting, thinking and remembering are propositional attitudes, while fearing and desiring are not. Merckx writes, propositions are neither appropriately fearsome nor appropriately desirable, and so are not fitting objects of fear and desire. For example, take the proposition Donald Trump will be re-elected. When we fear that he will be re-elected, we don't fear the proposition, we fear a concrete state of affairs. A person can believe in principles as propositions without fearing, desiring, or feeling guilty towards them. Additionally, if guilt must be directed at someone, why can't we direct it at ourselves? Emotions can be self-directed.
This objection on the page, the problem is that there's at least one obligation God can't command, namely the obligation to obey God's commands. I think that's basically confusing, again, the ontological status of the good. We're not saying the good is just ad hoc grounded in a being. We're saying that the moral obligations themselves are grounded in a necessary rational source, and then they sort of give them out. I mean, it just becomes arbitrary when you start saying that God can't command you to follow the good. I mean, the good itself is just, you have these commands that flow from the source, you follow them. I don't necessarily understand how this objection would be raised. What do you guys think?
I'd have to go through it. Oh, the
problem is that there's at least one obligation that God can't command, namely the obligation to obey God's commands. Therefore, the pure divine command theory is false.
You mean because of free will, right?
No, he's trying to say that. I mean,
well, because
he's saying that God can't. He's saying God can't give you the command to obey God's commandments, and I was like, well, why not?
Oh yeah.
If I give rules to my kids and I say, now follow the rules I've given you, that's not too much different.
Yeah.
I guess he's trying to appeal to a it's sort of like a modified Euthyphro's dilemma. It almost sounds like, is there a higher moral principle that commands us to obey the commands of God? And I think you just solve it the same way you'd solve the Euthyphro dilemma.
If you try to solve it in the same way as the Euthyphro dilemma, you will violate the transitivity of identity, which says that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Divine command theorists say that God equals good, but if you also say that God equals the principle that you are obligated to obey the commands of a competent authority, then you get the false equality that the good equals the principle that you are obligated to obey the commands of a competent authority. I'm not sure IP understands Cudworth's objection, so here's David Baggett to explain the problem.
Well, let me ask you a question to help our viewers along and make sure I'm clear with it so far. There are rights and duties that we have, obligations, responsibilities, that we can know about because God communicates commands to us. But could there be other things that are also obligatory and right for us to do, even if there really don't seem to be any pronouncements on the matter either way? Would there be an independent way to at least perhaps supplement divine commands? Is that something we should bother doing? Is it worthy of doing? Is it worthy of Christians to do?
Yeah, this is a great question. I remember struggling with it when I wrote my dissertation. Did I want to say that a divine command theory exhausts this matter of moral obligations, accounts for all of them, or only some of them?
Right.
I was inclined to say, all of them, but there is a puzzle here, which is this: do we have an obligation to obey God's commands? Right? Do we have an obligation to obey God's commands? This is problematic for the divine command theorist, right? I know you know why. Because if all obligations come about as a result of divine commands, then the idea is, well, if we do have an obligation to obey divine commands, it's because of God's divine command. But why obey that divine command is the question, right? Yes.
It's either circular
one,
or you have no way of answering the question.
It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one, and I think this is one of the more compelling objections to divine command theory. Again, it's one of those puzzles I like to think about it. Goes to this question of divine authority. What exactly makes for God having this kind of authority, if he indeed has it?
Isn't there a traditional Christian answer? I don't know how mainstream it is, but I've often heard Christians say it. The fact that a Christian is aware of God's existence and of God's supremacy and perfection, goodness, so forth, wouldn't that be a sufficient basis then to justify obedience to any communicated commands? Couldn't that be a way to connect the good and the right?
I'm inclined to say something like that myself, but it still does constitute something of an ongoing puzzle to me, in that if we have an obligation to obey God's commands, right, that is accounted for in a way other than divine commands, right? Maybe by pointing to God's goodness. Well, then we have to admit that we don't yet have in divine command theory an account of all moral obligations.
You've come up with the Baggett dilemma.
No, I'm not taking any. No, Cudworth came up with this. I wish.
I'm teasing.
Let's just call it the Baggett dilemma. I'm fine with it. I need something named after me, Shook. I desperately need something named after me.
We'll find something. That might take another show. But you were saying how there's an incompleteness problem. In other words, if the responsibility to obey divine commands is itself something that has to be divinely commanded, you're looking at some weird version of an infinite regress problem, something Lewis Carroll would love to puzzle over, maybe, right? Do I need a command to obey a command to obey a command, right?
Yeah, so at that point, I am probably inclined to say we're going to have to account for that authority in some other way than a divine command. In which case, I have to admit, and this goes to your first original question, that divine command theory in and of itself isn't going to be quite enough.
The point is that divine command theorists also need to appeal to a principle whose authority isn't based on a command. For even if God commanded you to follow the principle that you are obligated to obey the commands of a competent authority, we wouldn't consider that an obligation unless the principle was independently plausible. For consider if God commanded you to follow the principle that you should maximize pain. We wouldn't consider that authoritative, because that principle isn't independently plausible. IP thinks that other meta-ethical theories have the absurd consequence that they have obligations towards an abstract principle. The same absurdity holds for divine command theory. Thanks for watching.